What kind of world lets a child walk into a five-star restaurant barefoot, holding back tears, while everyone else looks away as if she doesn't belong there? Amara Johnson didn't understand the rules of Beverly Hills dining etiquette. Didn't know that tables here cost more than her family's monthly rent. Didn't know that the people seated beneath golden chandeliers measured worth in designer labels and quiet privilege, but she did understand pain, and right now it was all she could feel as she pushed through the glass doors of La Vitrina, a place where a single dinner bill could reach $300 without anyone blinking, her small frame trembling. Her left hand held out in front of her like something fragile she didn't know how to carry, the skin flushed and tender, her breathing uneven as she tried to stay quiet because somewhere deep inside she had already learned that loud children got removed, not helped, and the room reacted exactly the way rooms like this always did. When someone like her entered, conversations slowed but didn't stop, eyes flickered but never softened. A man in a tailored navy suit paused mid-sentence only long enough to glance at her before turning back to his wine. A woman in pearls leaned slightly away from the aisle as if distance alone could preserve her comfort. No one asked what happened. No one stood up. No one broke the invisible barrier between her world and theirs, and Amara took another step forward, her bare feet cold against the polished marble floor that reflected everything except her place in it. Her voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through the air because of what it carried. "She burned me, it hurts?" And for a moment the words hovered there, suspended between disbelief and inconvenience, as if the room itself was deciding whether they mattered. A server near the entrance hesitated but didn't move, his training louder than his instinct, because this wasn't the kind of problem that came with a tip, and from the far side of the dining room, past the velvet rope that separated ordinary wealth from something quieter and far more dangerous, Daniel Kong sat without shifting, his presence known even in stillness, a Korean-American man in his early 30s whose tailored black jacket blended seamlessly into the shadows of a private booth where the minimum spend was $2,000 and no one questioned it. His posture relaxed but his attention precise, observing without interruption, because men like him didn't react, they assessed, and across the room the balance of power remained exactly where it had always been, a little girl with nothing but pain in her hands and a room full of people with everything except the willingness to see it, and in that silence, before anyone chose a side, before truth had a chance to surface, the distance between them stretched so wide it might as well have been another world entirely. The silence that followed her voice did not break with concern. It shifted into something colder, something practiced, as if the room had already agreed on a version of events that did not include her truth, and one by one the whispers began to form, low and careful, shaped more by judgment than curiosity. A woman near the center table adjusted her designer handbag and murmured to her companion that children like this often wandered in from the street, that it was probably a misunderstanding, that staff should handle it quietly. A man with a watch worth more than 10 million Korean won glanced down at Amara and shook his head slightly, not in anger but in dismissal, as if her presence itself disrupted the order he had paid to maintain. And the staff, trained to prioritize comfort over confrontation, hesitated in that narrow space between responsibility and fear, because approaching her meant acknowledging her, and acknowledging her meant allowing her story to exist in a place that was not built for it. And so no one moved quickly enough to change anything, and Amara stood there, still holding out her hand, her small fingers trembling now not only from the lingering sting but from something deeper, something that felt like being unseen in a room full of eyes, her breathing uneven as she searched for someone, anyone, who might meet her where she was instead of where they believed she belonged. And from the far end of the room a server finally took a cautious step forward, his voice polite but distant as he asked if she needed assistance. The words careful, neutral, stripped of urgency, and before Amara could answer, before her voice could carry the weight it deserved, another voice cut through the room, calm and controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. Olivia Park emerged from the private section with a measured pace, her heels soft against the marble, her posture flawless, her expression composed in a way that suggested she had already decided how this moment would end, and in her hand was a cup, not steaming now but still warm enough to tell its own quiet story, and she looked at Amara not with cruelty, not openly, but with the subtle distance of someone who had already placed her in a category that did not require empathy, and when she spoke, her tone was gentle enough to pass as concern but firm enough to guide the room. She explained that the child had been too close, that accidents happened, that sometimes people did not understand boundaries, and the words settled quickly, too quickly, as if the room had been waiting for someone like her to translate the situation into something easier to accept, and the staff nodded, relieved to have direction, relieved to restore balance without disruption, and Amara felt it then, the shift, the way her truth slipped out of reach not because it was denied but because it was replaced. And she looked around again, her eyes searching, her voice smaller now but still holding on to what little certainty she had. And in that moment, the distance between her and everyone else did not feel like a few steps across a dining room. It felt like something measured in entire worlds, and somewhere behind that invisible line, Daniel Kong remained exactly where he was, watching, not intervening, not yet, because in rooms like this power did not rush forward, it waited for the right moment to reveal itself. And the question that hung in the air was not whether the truth would surface, but whether anyone would recognize it when it did. Olivia Park did not raise her voice again. She did not need to, because the room had already begun to lean in. Her direction, and that was the kind of influence that could not be taught or purchased in a single moment. It was something built over years of belonging, of never having to explain yourself twice, and she took one more step forward, just enough to stand between Amara and the rest of the room, not in protection but in quiet control, her eyes lowering briefly to the child's outstretched hand before lifting again with the same composed distance. And she spoke as if clarifying a minor inconvenience, saying that the restaurant served beverages at nearly 70 degrees Celsius, that accidents could feel worse than they were, that sometimes children reacted strongly when they were startled, and the explanation was clean, simple, easy to accept, the kind of explanation that allowed everyone else to remain comfortable without questioning their own inaction. And a few heads nodded almost immediately, grateful for a version of events that did not require discomfort, and the server, who had stepped forward earlier, hesitated again, now unsure whether to continue or retreat, because correcting someone like Olivia was not part of his job description. And Amara heard it all without fully understanding the temperature, the numbers, the careful phrasing, but she understood the result. She understood that her words were being folded into something else, something smaller, something that did not match what she had felt when the warmth first touched her skin. And she shook her head. Slightly, her voice fragile but steady enough to try again, saying that she did not touch anything, that she was just standing there, that she did not do anything wrong. And for a brief moment there was a flicker of hesitation in the room. Not because they believed her, but because she insisted, because she did not step back the way they expected her to, and that insistence created a small crack in the polished surface of certainty that Olivia had just laid down. But Olivia did not react with anger or frustration. She reacted with refinement, offering a small, almost sympathetic smile, the kind that suggested patience rather than conflict, and she turned slightly toward the staff, asking them to bring something cool for the child, to make sure she was guided outside where it would be more appropriate to assist her. And the phrasing was careful again, not a command, not a dismissal, but something in between that achieved both without appearing to do either. And the staff moved this time, not out of urgency but out of alignment, because the path had been made clear, and as one server reached for a glass of cool water and another gestured gently toward the exit, the room began to settle back into itself, conversations restarting in low tones, attention drifting back to menus and wine glasses, the disruption shrinking as quickly as it had appeared. And Amara felt that shift more sharply than anyone else, because for her nothing had changed. The discomfort remained, the confusion remained, the sense that something was not right remained, and yet everything around her was moving on as if it had already been resolved. And she looked once more across the room, past the tables, past the soft lighting, toward the one place where no one had spoken yet, where no one had intervened, where Daniel Kong still sat in silence, his gaze steady, his presence untouched by the explanations that had satisfied everyone else. And in that quiet space between what was said and what was seen, the truth did not disappear, it waited. Daniel Kong did not move when the staff began to guide the moment toward a quiet resolution, and that stillness carried more weight than any interruption could have. Because in a room designed around visible wealth and subtle dominance, the most powerful presence was often the one that did not compete for attention at all. And from where he sat behind the velvet boundary of the private section, the distance between him and the rest of the dining floor was not measured in meters but in something far less visible and far more absolute. A difference in consequence, in authority, in what his silence could mean if he chose to let it speak. And he watched as the server extended a glass of cool water toward Amara with careful hands, watched as another employee angled his body to gently guide her toward the exit, watched as Olivia Park maintained her composed posture, her explanation already accepted as the version that would remain, and for a moment nothing seemed out of place, nothing seemed urgent, everything appeared to be returning to the controlled rhythm that places like this depended on. But Daniel's gaze did not follow the movement of the staff or the approval of the guests. It remained fixed on the one detail that did not align, the way the child held her hand, not as if she had been careless, but as if she had been caught in something she did not understand, and that detail lingered longer than the explanation allowed, creating a quiet dissonance that did not belong in a room built on certainty. And without raising his voice, without signaling for attention, he shifted slightly in his seat, a small movement that did not appear significant to anyone unfamiliar with him but caused the server nearest the private section to pause mid-step, because even subtle changes carried meaning when they came from someone like Daniel Kong. And the pause spread in a ripple, one staff member hesitating, then another, until the momentum of resolution slowed just enough for the moment to stretch again, and Olivia noticed it, not immediately, but with the kind of awareness that came from knowing exactly how influence worked in spaces like this, and she turned her head slightly toward the private section, her expression unchanged but her focus sharpened, because she understood that silence could either protect her or dismantle her, depending on who held it. And Amara, still standing where she had been, felt that shift without knowing why, felt the room stop pretending to move forward, felt the space around her widen again into uncertainty, and she looked up once more, her eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time, not as a distant figure but as someone who had not yet decided what she was worth in this moment. And that gaze was not warm, not reassuring. It was steady and unreadable, the kind of gaze that measured before it acted, and when he finally spoke, it was not loud, it did not need to be. The tone carried clearly across the room, calm, deliberate, asking a question that no one else had chosen to ask. What exactly happened? And the words did not accuse, did not comfort, they simply reopened what had already been closed, and in that instant the carefully arranged version of events lost its certainty, because when someone like Daniel Kong questioned something, the room understood that the answer was no longer optional. The question did not echo, it settled, and in the kind of silence that followed, people did not look at Amara first, they looked at Olivia, because in rooms like this, truth often followed status. Before it followed facts, and Olivia understood that instinct instantly, her composure never breaking as she turned fully toward Daniel Kong. Her posture relaxed, her voice steady, answering before anyone else had the chance, explaining again that it was a simple misunderstanding, that the child had wandered too close, that the cup had slipped, that there had been no intention, and the explanation flowed smoothly, practiced not in repetition but in confidence, the kind that came from never being questioned seriously, and for a moment it seemed like the room might accept it again, because accepting it meant everything could return to normal. But Daniel did not respond immediately, he did not nod, he did not interrupt, he simply shifted his gaze away from Olivia and back to Amara, and that shift alone changed the direction of the room because it signaled that her answer was not enough, and Amara felt that attention land on her like something heavier than before, not comforting, not protective, but demanding in its own quiet way. And when Daniel spoke again, his voice remained calm, unchanged, but the words carried a different weight now, directed at her. Answer me. And the expectation in those two words was clear, not an invitation but a requirement, and Amara hesitated, not because she did not know what to say, but because she was not used to being asked in a way that meant the answer mattered, her fingers tightening slightly as she held her injured hand closer to her chest for a moment before extending it again, as if reminding herself why she had come forward at all. And she shook her head softly, her voice small but firm enough to hold its ground, saying that she did not touch anything, that she was standing still, that she did not spill anything, and her words did not rush. They came slowly, carefully, as if each one had to fight through the weight of the room before it could exist. And for a brief second, something shifted again. Not in the crowd, not in Olivia, but in Daniel, something subtle, almost imperceptible, the slightest pause in his breathing, the smallest delay before his eyes moved, because there was something familiar in the way she spoke, not the words themselves, but the way they carried certainty without defense. And yet that moment passed as quickly as it came, and his expression remained unreadable, controlled, and he turned his attention back toward Olivia once more, as if balancing two possibilities in silence, and Olivia met his gaze without hesitation, her confidence intact, because she had no reason to doubt the structure of the world she lived in, where her voice held weight and the child's did not. And around them the room remained suspended, no one returning to their conversations this time. No one pretending it was over, because Daniel Kong had not dismissed it, and as long as he had not dismissed it, it was not finished, and Amara stood between those two versions of reality, one spoken with certainty, the other held together by nothing but her own insistence, and for the first time since she entered, the outcome no longer belonged to the room, it belonged to him. Daniel Kong did not respond right away, and that silence felt different now, heavier, as if it carried the weight of something forming beneath the surface, something not yet visible but already changing the direction of everything around it. And his eyes remained on Amara, not searching for weakness, not searching for fear, but searching for something else entirely, something he had not expected to find in a place like this, and for a brief moment, something in the way she held her ground. The way her voice did not collapse even when it was ignored stirred a memory he did not welcome, a fragment of a past he had learned to keep distant, and it showed only for a fraction of a second, a subtle shift in his expression that most people in the room would never notice, but Olivia noticed, because she had spent enough time around him to recognize even the smallest cracks in his control, and that recognition unsettled her more than she allowed herself to show, so she stepped slightly closer, closing the space between them just enough to reassert her presence. Her voice softer now but more deliberate, explaining again that the situation had already been handled, that the child would be taken care of, that there was no need to escalate. Something so minor, and her choice of words was careful, not defensive but guiding, as if she were trying to protect him from unnecessary distraction. And for a moment, it almost worked, because Daniel's gaze shifted toward her again, and the balance of influence seemed to tilt back in her favor, and then Amara spoke again, not louder, not stronger but clearer, as if she had gathered the last piece of courage she had left, saying slowly, "I did not touch it. I was just standing there. I was waiting." And that last word lingered longer than the others, because it carried something unexpected, something that did not belong to the story Olivia had constructed, and Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of inconsistency, because waiting implied purpose, it implied that she had a reason to be there, a reason that no one had asked about, and for the first time since the moment began, his attention moved away from the surface details and into something deeper, something that required more than a quick judgment, and he leaned forward slightly, not enough to signal aggression, but enough to shift the atmosphere again, and when he spoke this time, his voice was still calm, but there was a different edge beneath it, quieter, more precise, waiting for what? And the question cut through the controlled narrative like a blade that did not need force to separate truth from convenience, and Amara hesitated again, not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer felt too small compared to the space it had to fill, and she looked down for a brief moment before lifting her eyes again, meeting his gaze with the same fragile determination, saying, "My mom said to wait here. She said someone would help us." And the words did not just add information, they shifted the entire foundation of what had been assumed, because now the situation was no longer random, it was no longer an accident involving a child who did not belong, it was something else entirely, something that suggested intention beyond what Olivia had described, and Daniel felt that shift settle in his mind, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since he entered this moment, the possibility that he had misread something, even slightly, began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet accepted, but present enough to remain, and that presence was enough to keep the silence from resolving, enough to hold the room in place just a little longer, because now the question was no longer what had happened, it was why it had happened at all. The word waiting did not fade the way her earlier words had, it stayed in the air, quiet but persistent, and in a place where everything was measured and controlled. Something as simple as a child saying she was told to wait began to disturb the carefully constructed order more than any raised voice ever could. And Daniel Kong felt that disturbance settle into his thinking with a clarity he could not ignore, because waiting implied expectation, and expectation implied that someone had directed her there, which meant this was no longer a random moment but a sequence that had been set in motion before she ever stepped through the door, and his gaze shifted slightly, not toward Olivia this time, but toward the staff, scanning the edges of the room where movement often revealed more than words, and there it was, subtle but present, a hesitation in the way one of the servers stood near the service station. Her posture too still, her eyes lowered not out of respect but out of avoidance, and Daniel recognized that kind of stillness instantly. It was not neutrality, it was restraint, the kind that came from knowing something that had not been said, and without raising his voice or breaking the calm that defined him. He redirected the focus with a single glance, a gesture so minimal that most of the guests did not even register it, but the server did, her shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly as if she had been called without hearing her name, and Olivia noticed it at the same time, her attention shifting with precision, her expression unchanged but her awareness sharpening again, because control in a situation like this did not depend on volume, it depended on maintaining the narrative, and any deviation from that narrative, no matter how small, had to be managed before it grew into something irreversible, and she stepped forward half a pace, just enough to re-enter the center of attention. Her voice calm as she added that the child might have misunderstood instructions, that sometimes people were told to wait in areas that were not meant for them. That confusion happened, and the explanation was smooth, almost reassuring. But this time it did not settle as easily, because the foundation had already shifted, and Daniel did not look at her when she spoke. He kept his focus on the server instead, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make avoidance uncomfortable. And that silence was different from before. It was not passive, it was directed. It asked for something without saying it outright, and the server felt it, the weight of being seen when she had hoped to remain invisible, and she swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the tray she held, her instinct telling her to remain quiet, to follow protocol, to protect her position, but something in the way Daniel waited, in the way he did not rush or threaten, made it harder to hide behind silence. And she took a small step forward before she could stop herself, her voice low, almost hesitant, saying that the child had been standing near the private section for several minutes before anything happened, that she had not been touching anything, that she had been looking around as if she was expecting someone, and the words came carefully, not accusing, not dramatic, but real enough to disrupt what had been accepted, and the moment they were spoken, the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, because now there was more than one version of the truth, and Olivia's composure held, but the space around her felt less certain, less controlled, and Daniel absorbed the new detail without reacting outwardly. But inside, the pattern was becoming clearer, not complete, not confirmed, but enough to change the direction of his thinking, because now the question was no longer whether the child had made a mistake, it was why her presence had been treated as one at all. The moment the server's words settled into the room, the carefully balanced illusion began to tilt in a way that could no longer be ignored, and for the first time since the situation began, the quiet confidence that had surrounded Olivia Park did not expand. It tightened, almost imperceptibly, like something adjusting under pressure, and she turned her gaze toward the server with a composed expression that remained polite on the surface but carried a subtle edge beneath it, the kind that reminded people where they stood without ever saying it directly, and she responded calmly, explaining that observations could be misinterpreted, that standing near a private section without authorization was itself a problem, that the staff should be more focused on maintaining boundaries than speculating about intentions, and her tone was not harsh, it did not need to be, because it leaned on the structure of authority that everyone in the room understood, and for a brief second it seemed as though the balance might return to her side, because no one in that environment was accustomed to challenging someone like her openly. But Daniel Kong did not follow that shift. He remained still, his attention no longer divided, his focus narrowing with a precision that made everything else in the room feel secondary, and he replayed the details in silence, the child's words, the hesitation in her voice, the server's account, the timing, the placement, the subtle inconsistencies that did not align with the version Olivia had provided, and none of it formed a complete answer yet, but it formed enough doubt to prevent acceptance, and that doubt carried weight because it came from someone who did not rely on appearances to make decisions, and after a moment that felt longer than it was, he spoke again, not raising his voice, not shifting his tone, but asking a question that cut deeper into the structure of what had been presented. If she was not supposed to be there, who told her to wait there? And the question did not just challenge the situation, it challenged the assumption that the child had acted alone, and the room felt it immediately because now the focus was no longer on what she did, but on who had placed her in that position, and Olivia paused for the first time, not visibly enough to break her composure, but long enough to register as something different, because that was not a question she could answer with the same ease, and in that pause, the space for uncertainty widened, and Amara, still standing where she had been, felt something shift again, not outside of her this time, but within, because for the first time since she had spoken, someone was not just listening. Someone was asking the kind of question that made her words matter, and she held her breath for a second before answering quietly, saying that her mother told her to wait near the entrance, but a man in a suit had told her to stand closer to the private section, that he said someone important would come out to speak with her, and the words landed with a clarity that changed everything, because now there was a new element, one that had not been part of any explanation before, and Daniel's eyes shifted slightly, not toward Olivia, not toward the staff, but toward the edges of the room again, searching for the missing piece. That had just been introduced, and Olivia's composure held, but something beneath it had begun to fracture, because the narrative she had controlled from the beginning was no longer contained. It had expanded beyond her influence, and in that expansion, control was no longer guaranteed, it had to be reclaimed, and for the first time since she stepped forward, she did not speak immediately because now, the next words would matter more than the ones before, and in a room where power usually dictated reality, reality itself was beginning to push back. The moment Amara mentioned the man in the suit, the atmosphere inside La Vitrina shifted in a way that could no longer be disguised as coincidence, because this was no longer a misunderstanding between a child and a guest. It had become something structured, something that suggested intent beyond a single action, and Daniel Kong recognized that pattern immediately, not because it was obvious to anyone else in the room, but because he had spent years understanding how influence moved quietly through controlled environments, and his gaze sharpened slightly as he processed the new detail, not reacting outwardly but recalibrating internally, tracing the sequence backward in his mind. A child told to wait, redirected by someone with enough authority to be believed, positioned near a private section where access was restricted, and then something happened that was immediately reframed as her mistake, and the more he considered it, the less it resembled an accident and the more it resembled a setup that had gone unnoticed until now, and his eyes moved again across the room, slower this time, more deliberate, scanning not for movement, but for absence, because the man Amara described was no longer present, and that absence carried its own meaning, and near the service station, the manager, who had remained silent until this point, stepped forward just enough to interrupt the direction the moment was taking. His voice polite but firmer than before as he addressed the situation in a way that attempted to close it again, saying that there was no record of such an instruction, that staff would never direct a child into a restricted area, that perhaps there had been confusion or miscommunication, and his words were careful, positioned to protect the establishment, to reinforce the idea that procedures had been followed correctly, and for a second it seemed like the structure might hold, because the manager's role gave his statement weight, but Daniel did not look at him when he spoke. He kept his attention on Amara, as if the official explanation carried less value than the unfiltered one, and that choice alone unsettled the manager more than any direct challenge could have, because it signaled that authority alone was no longer enough to define truth, and Olivia, sensing the shift becoming more difficult to control, spoke again, her tone still composed but carrying a subtle urgency now, suggesting that the situation was becoming unnecessarily complicated, that the child needed care rather than questioning, that focusing on responsibility would not help resolve anything, and her words were designed to redirect the moment away from inquiry and back toward resolution. But Daniel did not accept the redirection, not this time, because the pattern in his mind had reached a point where ignoring it would mean choosing convenience over clarity, and he spoke again, his voice steady, cutting through the overlapping attempts to close the situation. Find him. And the simplicity of the instruction carried more force than any argument, because it did not debate, it did not explain, it acted, and the staff froze for a fraction of a second before moving, not out of confusion but out of recognition, because when Daniel Kong gave a directive, it was not a suggestion, it was a decision, and as two members of the staff quickly moved toward the back corridor, the room fell into a deeper silence than before, one that no longer waited for explanation but for revelation, and Amara stood at the center of it, still holding her hand, still unsure of what would happen next, but no longer completely alone in the truth she had tried to hold on to from the beginning.